Welcome to the deep dive. You know why you're here. To get right into it, fast and deep. And we've got a lot to dig into today. We're diving into a really unsettling case and trying to piece together what happened in Holcomb, Kansas before this horrible crime.
Yeah. You look through all this material, and the first thing that jumps out is how Holcomb is described. An aimless congregation of buildings cut in half by the Santa Fe Railroad tracks, the Arkansas River on one side, Route 50 on the other, unpaved streets, dusty in the summer, thick with mud when it rains, almost like it's a place more about its location than anything else.
It does kind of have a, what's the word, a melancholy feel to it, like a town that's seen better days. The closed bank from the 30s now turned into apartments, the dark dance sign.
Right, exactly. There's this sense of faded glory, a place that's sort of stuck in time.
Okay, so into this setting walks Herbert William Clutter, the man in charge of River Valley Farm. 48 years old, picture of health, just under 5'10", broad shoulders, dark hair, square jaw. Looks like he could wrestle a bull, you know what I mean?
Yeah, very much the image of a strong, successful American farmer.
And his background backs that up. He trained in agriculture at Kansas State University, active in everything in Holcomb and even in Garden City. Headed the building committee for the First Methodist Church, chaired the Kansas Conference of Farm Organizations, served on a federal board during the Eisenhower years. Not the wealthiest guy around, but a man of influence, you could say.
Definitely a pillar of the community,
Yeah.
involved in all aspects of life there, which, thinking about it, makes the crime even more disturbing. It's not just an attack on one family, it's almost like an attack on Holcomb itself, on what Mr. Clutter represented.
Yeah, good point. So we see this successful, active guy, and then we meet Alfred Stokelane, who worked on the farm. There's this small moment that morning. Stokelane mentions his baby is sick, and Mr. Clutter immediately offers help. Just a human moment, you know?
Absolutely, a glimpse into a kinder, more compassionate side makes what comes later even harder to comprehend.
All right, now let's shift gears and talk about Perry Smith, one of the men who would shatter this sense of peace. Seems very focused on his appearance, talks about his changed face, and spends a lot of time looking in the mirror. His background's quite different from Mr. Clutter's. His mother was full Cherokee, his father Irish, and he had this dream of singing in Vegas. Could it be that he was looking for a way out, a way to make a name for himself, and that fueled his actions?
It's certainly possible, that obsession with how he looks, the changed face, maybe he wasn't comfortable with who he was, trying to project a different image. And yeah, that Vegas dream, it speaks to a yearning for something bigger, an escape from his reality.
So we also meet Nancy Clutter, and we learn about her friendship with Susan Kidwell. It's mentioned that Mr. Clutter wasn't happy about Susan transferring to a school in Garden City. Shows how important the local community was to him, right?
Right. That loyalty to Holcomb. He believed in its schools, maybe saw it as a kind of betrayal to go elsewhere.
Nancy also mentioned smelling smoke, even though there weren't any ashtrays in the house. Do you think, looking back, that could have been some sort of premonition, a sign that something was off?
Maybe. It's interesting, isn't it? It could have been nothing, just a weird smell, or maybe some kind of subconscious anxiety. But in hindsight, it almost feels like foreshadowing.
Briefly, we're introduced to Dick Hickok, who's working with Perry. Dick seems happy with their work, but Perry's pretty quiet, maybe even a little resentful. Makes you wonder what their relationship was really like.
Yeah, definitely. You get the feeling there's more going on beneath the surface. Maybe Dick is hiding something or just not picking up on Perry's true feelings. And that silence from Perry, it feels ominous somehow.
Then we have these everyday scenes. Nancy teaching Jolene to bake a pie, Jolene all proud of herself, Mrs. Clutter with a headache, not wanting any pie, Nancy mentioning plans, Roxy Lee Smith's trumpet solo, errands for her mom, a bridal shower, Thanksgiving. It's like such normal stuff, you know?
Mhm.
Makes it even harder to believe what would happen later that night.
It's like you said, everyday life. It really emphasizes the suddenness and the brutality of the crime.
So Mrs. Clutter, she's talking to Jolene, and mentions that Mr. Clutter travels a lot and always brings her back little gifts. A penny paper fan from San Francisco, things like that. It's a sweet detail.
It is. It shows a different side to their marriage. These little gestures, these small acts of love amidst the busyness of their lives.
Then we learn that Mrs. Clutter had struggled with depression after her children were born, lived a bit separately from her husband, found comfort in her faith, hoped it was just a pinched nerve. It makes you think about how much goes on behind closed doors, even in families that seem to have it all together.
Definitely. It's a reminder that we never know what someone else is going through. She was struggling internally, but outwardly, they were this successful family.
And on this particular Saturday, she's all alone in the house. Her husband and son are in Garden City. The housekeeper's gone. Just before this, She gave that little paper fan to Jolene, the one her husband brought her. It's small detail, but it feels significant.
Yeah, it's like a symbolic moment. It emphasizes her loneliness and makes what's about to happen even more tragic.
So we're introduced to Garden City, described as a typical town, but the kind of place people are proud to call home. Friendly folks, fresh air, good schools, good neighbors, beautiful churches, even a golf course. A well-run library, a newspaper, green squares, safe streets, a big park with polar bears and an elephant, and the world's largest free swimming pool. And it's quiet after 8 p.m. Everyone knows everyone, and they like it that way.
It's that strong sense of community that makes the crime so shocking. In a place where you feel safe and secure, this kind of violence is almost unimaginable.
And Mr. Clutter, he was this educated, successful guy, Republican, church leader, Methodist, right? But he didn't go in for fancy parties or playing cards. He'd like to be doing something, accomplishing something. So that Saturday, he was chairing a meeting for the 4-H club. You know about 4-H. What do you think that tells us about Mr. Clutter?
4-H is all about practical skills, leadership, building character. Head, heart, hands, and health, that's their motto. So it fits perfectly with Mr. Clutter's personality, hardworking, focused on achievement, invested in the future, and especially the young people in his community.
At that meeting, he specifically praises Mrs. Holko Ishida, a Japanese woman who'd moved to Holcomb a couple of years earlier. Even suggests she should be honored at their banquet. It's interesting, isn't it? Shows a real openness, especially for that time.
Absolutely. Back then, prejudice was unfortunately common, so for him to publicly praise Mrs. Ishida, it speaks volumes about his character. He valued people for who they were, not their background.
Later, Mrs. Ishida talks to Mr. Clutter about her family maybe moving to Nebraska for a better farm. She's sad to leave Holcomb, mentions he once gave her and her kids a ride home from a 4-H meeting. Her last words to him are that she can't imagine him ever being afraid. And then she thinks to herself, he probably didn't believe anything bad could ever happen to him. What an incredibly sad foreshadowing.
Right. It's heartbreaking. He represented this sense of security, and then it's all shattered.
There's also Mr. Helm, Bonnie Clutter's brother, pruning her rose bushes, worried about losing his job because the farm might be sold. He remembers Mr. Clutter saying he hoped the Clutters and the Helms would always be at River Valley Farm. It's a reminder of how this tragedy would ripple outwards, affecting so many people.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about the immediate family. This tragedy would change the lives of everyone connected to the Clutters.
Sunday morning, the news breaks. 2 ambulances speeding toward the Clutter property. The mail carrier, Mother Truitt, stops her route to spread the word. Even the description of the rundown post office adds to the feeling of this quiet place suddenly thrust into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons.
It's like the end of innocence, the end of peace. Mother Truitt stopping her route, it shows how extraordinary this was, how it disrupted everything.
Then you have Mrs. Clare, and her reaction is surprising. She hears about Mr. Clutter's death, and instead of being shocked, she talks about how he could be pushy and always in a hurry. Makes you realize that even someone who seems like a pillar of the community can be seen differently by others.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that people are complex. We all have different sides, and different people see those different sides.
We also see Susan Kidwell heartbroken, wanting to tell Bobby Rupp about Nancy, but he already knows. Bobby just staring at the farm, not saying a word, his brother worried about him. They walk toward the farm, which is now blocked off, and incredibly, Bobby's immediately considered a suspect. Just awful.
It is. You have this young couple in love, and then this happens. And the suspicion falling on Bobby, the grieving boyfriend, it's just another layer of tragedy.
The investigation kicks off. Alvin Dewey and the KBI team interviewing everyone. School staff, people who worked on the farm, friends, neighbors, family. About 20 people show up for the funeral, which shows how well regarded the family was.
Absolutely. The scale of the investigation, the number of people affected, it all speaks to the magnitude of the crime.
Meanwhile, Dick Hickok is eating like a horse, can't get enough food. Perry, on the other hand, has no appetite at all, barely touching anything except aspirin, cigarettes, and root beer. Perry even makes a sarcastic comment about Dick's idea of success. What do you make of their reactions?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Dick's behavior is almost unsettling, like he's completely unaffected. But Perry, he seems to be really struggling, maybe wrestling with guilt or at least processing it all very differently.
Then there's this recurring dream Perry has. A parrot, a snake guarding a tree full of diamonds, and Perry climbing to a paradise where there's tons of food. He even mentions 2 versions of the paradise, one where he's powerful and one where he's a kid surrounded by food. What do you think it all means?
Dreams can be so powerful. The parrot, maybe it's his conscience, or the fear of being judged. The snake and diamonds, maybe it's temptation, the lure of a better life. And that paradise with all the food, it probably reflects a deep longing for something he never had, a sense of security and abundance. The two versions could represent his inner conflict wanting power, but also just wanting his basic needs met.
Then we have Bonnie Clutter's brother, Howard Fox. He sends a telegram, a letter expressing gratitude to the people of Garden City. He asks them to forgive the person who did this, says that the killer will suffer enough just from knowing what they did. To be able to talk about forgiveness after something like this, it's incredible.
It is. Shows a remarkable strength of character and faith. He's choosing compassion over revenge, believing that true justice comes from within. A powerful message, especially in the midst of such grief and anger.
Mrs. Hida, the woman who is thinking of moving to Nebraska, she decides to go. She tells her friend that something in Holcomb has changed for her, that she can't stay. This shows how this crime affected the whole community, even those who weren't directly involved.
Yeah, she realized that the place she thought was safe wasn't. That sense of security was shattered.
Dewey, the lead investigator, he's so focused on the case that he forgets to pick up his wife's cat from the vet. Shows how consumed he was by this.
Right, it's all he could think about. The case had taken over his life.
At Hartman's cafe, Mrs. Hartman even mentions how much weight Dewey has lost. He admits that the investigation is taking its toll. They followed over 700 leads, including this bizarre one about some phantom Mexicans Paul Helm thought he saw. Can you imagine chasing down that many leads?
It must have been exhausting, both physically and mentally. And that Phantom Mexican story, it probably says more about the fear and paranoia in the community than anything else.
We then hear about Dewey entering the Clutter house. It's described so vividly. The house is still warm. There's the scent of lemon polish, sheet music on the piano coming through the rye, Herb Clutter's hat, Kenyon's glasses. It's like a snapshot of their lives, frozen in time.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. All those little details, the things they left behind, it really brings home the reality of the loss. That sheet music, it's like they just got up and left.
So Nye, one of the investigators, interviews Mr. Hickok, Dick's father. He says that Dick and Perry went to Fort Scott to visit Perry's sister and get some money, like $1,500. But we find out later this is a lie.
Right, that's a key point. It establishes an alibi that will quickly unravel.
Nye keeps asking about Dick's behavior when he got back from Fort Scott. His father says he seemed normal, ate like he always did. But again, this turns out to be false.
It seems like the family was either in denial or intentionally covering for him.
We then get inside Perry's head. He's in the car with Dick, a guy named Mr. Bell, and he finds Dick's jokes and behavior, well, queer and egomaniacal considering what they've just done.
It's a fascinating glimpse into Perry's psyche. He seems to have a greater awareness of the gravity of the situation than Dick.
And then, as Dick is telling these jokes, a third hitchhiker gets in the car, a black soldier. Perry later says he thinks this is what stopped him from doing something to Mr. Bell. It's amazing how these chance encounters can change things.
Absolutely. Just a random event, but who knows what might have happened if that soldier hadn't gotten in the car.
The investigation continues, and Nye ends up at a rooming house in Las Vegas. He shows a landlady pictures of Dick and Perry, and she recognizes Perry. This allows Nye to get the local police involved, and soon there's a memo out identifying them as parole violators considered dangerous. They're also looking for the stolen radio, and they find a pawn ticket for Perry's bearskin rug, which leads them to his dress. A big break in the case.
It is. Nye's persistence is paying off. Those little clues, the pawn ticket, it all adds up.
They find Perry's belongings in a storage room. A box with "Beware" scrawled on it. Inside, a dirty pillow marked "Souvenir of Honolulu." A pink baby blanket, some clothes, a pan, a towel. And the knot used to tie the box is different from the knots used on the Clutters. What does that collection of items tell you about Perry?
It paints a picture of a transient life, maybe a bit of a lost soul. That beware is interesting, maybe a sign of his defensiveness, his need to keep people at a distance. And the baby blanket, it suggests a yearning for innocence, maybe a longing for something he never had.
Nye tracks down Perry's sister, Mrs. Johnson, in San Francisco. She's not shocked that the police are looking for him, though she's upset about the timing. She says she hasn't seen Perry in 4 years, not since he visited their father in Reno when he was on parole. Their father was angry with Perry, and they hadn't spoken since.
It's another piece of the puzzle showing a family background filled with conflict and estrangement.
Mrs. Johnson mentions Perry had a friend, Joe James, an Indian logger in Washington, and a woman Perry introduced as his wife back in '55. Seems like Perry tried to connect with people, but it never lasted.
Yeah, there's a sense of loneliness there, maybe a longing for connection, but an inability to make it work.
Back in Garden City, rumors are flying, people speculating about who could have done this. Some thought it was connected to the Kansas Wheat Growers Association, others that it was a ranch hand who'd been fired. The closest guess was a disgruntled UX employee just out of prison. Shows how desperately people were trying to make sense of this senseless act.
It does. It was so shocking, so out of place in their community, they needed to find an explanation.
After Christmas, Dick and Perry are in Miami Beach. Dick is out there in his swim trunks, while Perry stays fully clothed, apparently self-conscious about his legs. Perry's reading about the Walker family murders in Florida. He finds it amazing, even wonders if some lunatic got inspired by the Kansas case. Dick doesn't care. He's busy collecting seashells. Even remembers how, as a kid, he was jealous of another boy's shells and smashed them. What a contrast.
It is. Perry's fixated on this other crime, maybe trying to understand his own actions. And Dick, he's completely self-absorbed, still driven by those petty childhood impulses.
Nye keeps digging. Asks Hickok about a change in his work schedule back in November. Hickok lies again, says Perry got paroled, and he got a letter from Idaho about their plan to go to Acapulco and start a fishing boat business. Another layer of deception.
He's trying to cover his tracks, build a narrative that distances him from the crime. But the more he lies, the more the net tightens.
And Nye calls him on it. Confronts him about the lie about Fort Scott. Points out that Perry doesn't have a sister there and the post office would have been closed. This is where it starts to fall apart for Hickok.
Absolutely. Nye's got the facts, and he's not letting up. Hickok's alibi is crumbling.
The detectives confront Perry, too, about Fort Scott and about him saying he picked up girls at a motel. They're closing in on both of them now.
It's the beginning of the end for their web of lies.
The trial starts, and there's a huge crowd at the courthouse. High school kids, mothers with babies, men with their children, Boy Scouts, even a women's bridge club. A reporter is asking people what they think the punishment should be. It's a spectacle.
It shows how deeply this crime affected the community. They wanted justice. They needed to see these men held accountable. But it also raises questions about whether they could get a fair trial with all this public pressure.
The undersheriff, Wendell Meyer, and his wife Josephine are surprisingly kind to Dick and Perry. Josie even brings them extra food. Perry tells her he can't eat, that he has no appetite. He says the crowd reminds him of a scene from a movie, a biblical movie, where a man was torn apart. Says he's afraid of the same thing happening to him. Josie tries to reassure him.
It's a human moment amidst all the darkness. Josie shows compassion for these men, even though they're accused of this horrific crime. And Perry's fear, it's palpable. He knows what people think of him, and he's terrified.
We hear about Perry's cell, his notes. Dewey visits him, and Perry refuses to sign a 78-page statement, even though he's admitted to most of it. Says he wants to change two things. He wasn't the only one who killed the Clutters, and it wasn't Dick who killed Nancy and her mother. Even after confessing, he's still trying to control the narrative.
It's complex, isn't it? He's admitted to the crime, but he's still trying to manage how it's perceived.
Perry is writing letters to Don Cullivan. Says what he did is unforgivable, that he expects to be executed. He even comes up with this wild plan to escape once a hacksaw blade smuggled in. He's resigned to his fate, but still holding on to a sliver of hope.
It shows the human will to survive, even in the face of the impossible.
Then there's the auction. All the Clutter family's belongings are sold off, including Nancy's horse, Babe. Sue Kidwell, Nancy's friend, is there, watching it all. It's like a final goodbye, a scattering of their lives.
It's a somber event, a physical reminder of their absence.
At the trial, the defense lawyers go after Floyd Wells, one of the key witnesses for the prosecution. They bring up his nickname, Squealer, talk about his time in jail, trying to discredit him.
It's a standard tactic, trying to cast doubt on the witness's character, make the jury question his motives.
Dewey takes the stand, and his testimony is really damaging. He talks about Perry's confession, how Perry said Dick made a comment about Nancy and Perry stopped him. Then he drops the bombshell. Perry later said he killed all four of the Clutters alone. Everyone's stunned, even Dick.
That's a major turning point. Perry's confession and then this change in his story, it throws everything into question.
The defense tries to use a psychiatrist, ask him how many murderers he's dealt with, whether he thinks Dick knew right from wrong when the crime happened. But the judge says the psychiatrist can only answer yes or no, really limits what the defense can do.
It does. They're trying to present a more nuanced argument, exploring Dick's mental state, but the judge won't allow it.
After that, they drop Dick's defense. Perry's counselor, Arthur Fleming, brings in people to talk about Perry's character. A reverend, a friend named Joe James, Donald Cullivan, a doctor. But the prosecution objects, and their testimony doesn't have much impact. The court isn't interested in hearing about their past.
It's like they've already decided. The focus is on the crime, not the people who committed it.
Then there's this study on motiveless murders that's discussed. The researchers found some common traits among the killers. They don't really understand why they did it. They feel detached during the act. They have a history of aggression. They often feel physically inferior or worried about seeming weak. They had violent or emotionally deprived childhoods. They often don't feel anger during the violence. They have trouble forming relationships. They feel lonely, and they often don't feel guilty afterward. The study also mentions the idea of murder-prone personalities who might be triggered by subconsciously connecting the victim to someone from their traumatic past. What do you make of all this?
It's fascinating. It provides a psychological framework for understanding these kinds of crimes. And a lot of what they describe seems to fit Perry. His difficult childhood, his emotional detachment, his trouble forming lasting relationships. Dick, too, to some extent, though maybe not as complex emotionally.
The source then brings up another case. Two soldiers, George York and James Latham. They went on a killing spree, murdered 7 people. York had a decent upbringing, but Latham had a terrible childhood, unwanted, unloved. But they both hated the world. Latham even said that meanness was the only thing people understood. They killed people in Tennessee, stole a car, then killed more people in Illinois. In Kansas, they killed Otto Ziegler, a kind old man who stopped to help them. York just shrugged and said he wasn't mean, just an old man. It's chilling.
It's a reminder that evil can take many forms. These two, so different in their backgrounds, yet both capable of such cold-blooded violence. And killing a man who was just trying to help them, it shows how random and senseless their acts were.
Hickok and Latham were both in prison when another inmate, Andy, was executed. They watched it happen. The chaplain taking off Andy's glasses, the silence, a dog barking in the distance. Latham flinched when the trapdoor opened. Hickok later said Andy acted strange in the days before his death. Eating fried chicken, smoking cigars, drinking Coke, even writing poetry. He said goodbye to Hickok, joked about how he'd see him on the other side. Andy said he didn't believe in heaven or hell. His aunt and uncle made sure he was buried near the people he killed. And he gave Hickok a poem he'd written.
It's a surreal and disturbing image. Andy facing his death with this strange detachment, finding comfort in these simple pleasures. And that poem, it's almost like a final act of human connection.
Hickok was still smoking like a chimney. Said there was no point in quitting now. He even mentioned waking up after Andy's execution and calling out for him. Shows how much of an impact it had, even on someone like Hickok.
It does. Even amidst their own brutality, there was still a sense of shared experience, a connection forged in that environment.
Then there were the appeals. Lawyers from Kansas City, Jenkins and Bingham, appointed by a federal judge, fought for them for years. They argued that the convictions were unfair, that the men weren't given lawyers before they confessed, that their lawyers at trial were incompetent, that evidence was obtained illegally, and that all the publicity made it impossible for them to get a fair trial. They took their case to the Supreme Court 3 times, but they lost every time. Finally, the Kansas Supreme Court set an execution date. The governor, Governor Avery, could have granted clemency, but he refused. He would later refuse clemency for York and Latham, too.
So after all those years, their fate was sealed. No second chances.
Hickok's execution. Rain pounding on the roof of the warehouse. Hickok arrives with the guards and the chaplain. The warden reads the execution order. Hickok asks if the Clutter family is there. He seems disappointed when he finds out they're not.
It's a chilling detail, almost like he wanted to face them one last time.
The hangman is impatient. Hickok steps onto the scaffold. The chaplain says a prayer. They put the noose around his neck, cover his face. Then silence. The trapdoor opens. Hickok hangs there for 20 minutes before they pronounce him dead. A hearse takes his body away. One of the KBI agents, Roy Church, says he was surprised by Hickok's courage.
A strange observation, isn't it? To find courage in a man who committed such a terrible act.
Now, on to Perry. He's brought in, the chaplain by his side. He looks smaller than Dewey remembers. He looks at the crowd. Dewey sees his sister, Mrs. Johnson, in the front row. She nods at him.
Another quiet human moment amidst this terrible event.
They lead Terry up the wooden steps. He looks at the noose, at the trapdoor. The warden reads the death warrant. Perry asks if he can say something. The warden hesitates, then nods.
What do you think he's going to say?
Perry clears his throat. He speaks to the witnesses, says he doesn't believe in capital punishment, morally or legally, says it's just another way of committing murder.
A powerful statement, and ironic considering the circumstances.
He apologizes for what he did, says he knows it's not enough, Says he wishes he could pay back the Clutter family for what he took from them.
A glimmer of remorse.
He says he's not the same person he was when he committed the murders. Says he's tried to be a better person while in prison.
Do you think he's being sincere?
There's a pause. Then Perry says he wishes he could have said this to the people of Garden City before now, but he wasn't allowed visitors, and his letters were censored.
A final attempt to connect, to express his regret.
He looks at his sister again, then at the crowd. Says he hopes they'll find it in their hearts to forgive him. He's finished.
A powerful, haunting ending to his story.
They put the black hood over his head. He doesn't resist. The hangman steps back. The trapdoor opens. Perry drops. And that's the end of the deep dive into this truly chilling case.
It leaves you with a lot to think about. The brutality of the crime, the complexities of the killers, the ripples of grief and loss that spread through the community.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, what really drives a person to commit such a terrible act? Is it nature, nurture, something else entirely? What could have been done to prevent this? These are the questions that stay with you long after you've finished examining the evidence.
They do. It's a case that challenges our understanding of human nature, of good and evil, and it makes you realize that sometimes there are no easy answers.
Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.
Thank you.